Good evening. I'm Elaine Steele, and it was my pleasure to have known Mrs. Parks for 45 years. I met her as a student in high school. I had an after-school job, and at a sewing factory, at Stockton Sewing Factory. And when I arrived at the sewing factory, my seatmate was Rosa Parks. I could hardly believe it. It was just overwhelming. I must say that I lasted in that job about 5 days, and it was a mutual decision between the employer and the employee that perhaps there was a better profession for me. And I did not, and so I left there and got another job, and where I did very well. And after graduation, I started working for the courts, and Mrs. Parks was working for Congressman John Conyers as a congressional aide. And we started commuting home together, and the rest is history. So that was how our friendship began, and it lasts until today because she still lives very deeply in my heart and within the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development. And Anita is going to tell you, our executive director, why I was so excited about my seatmate being Rosa Parks, because some of you may not know.
Good evening. And most people think they do know all there is to know about Rosa Parks, but there's a lot that you may not know about that incident on December 1st, 1955. For example, the fact that Mrs. Parks was not sitting in the white section. She was sitting in the first row of the colored section. And the buses were supposed to be, or any mode of transportation at that time, it was to be separate but equal. There was supposed to be 50-50. That is what the separate but equal law said. But in practice, there were many different customs which were humiliating to colored people, as we were called at that time, people of color, because you didn't necessarily have to be African American to suffer that indignity. You could be Asian, you could be Native American, and sometimes you could be European, but it was all in the decision of the bus driver. And in the South, and in Alabama in particular, the law seemed to, or the custom seemed to be more humiliating than in some other places. For example, you paid your fare, got off the bus, and had to go around to the back of the bus and get on again. And if you didn't move quickly enough, you may lose your fare because the bus took off and you were on the outside looking in. But on that particular day, by 1955, more than 60% of the riders on the bus were black. So therefore, there should not have been a difficulty with Mrs. Parks finding a seat if separate but equal was what was being practiced. She got on the bus, paid her fare, and she sat in the first row of the colored section. The bus was crowded. She took the last open seat. But there were still seats in the white section. Several stops later, the bus filled up, and there was one white man left standing. He was a young man and did not ask for a seat. And the bus driver asked for 4, not 1, 4 people to get up, 2 on either side, because the custom was that there could be no white people sitting in a row with colored. So that meant that 4 people were going to have to stand up for 1 person to sit down. And Mrs. Parks said she didn't see how that was going to make things better for her. So the first time they asked for all 4 of them to get up, no one moved. But the second time, when the bus driver threatened jail, the other 3 people got up, but Mrs. Parks stayed sitting. And people have given different reasons. Some said it was because she was the secretary of the NAACP. Well, in those days, in the NAACP, the only 2 jobs in Montgomery, Alabama you could hold as a female was secretary and youth director. Johnny Carr, her dear friend, would be secretary sometimes, and she would be secretary sometimes. One would be youth director, or the other would be youth director. At that particular time, she just happened to be the youth director. So it had nothing to do with status. It just had to do with the fact that Mrs. Parks had made up her mind that it was difficult enough to live under segregation, but by us giving in to more humiliation, it just made it worse. And at that time, the NAACP was negotiating with the city so that when there were vacant seats on the bus, that the people in the colored section did not have to continue to stand, because the way it was, even if the white section was completely empty, people of color could not sit in those seats unless they were a nurse or a nanny accompanying someone. So everyone would be crowded into the back of the bus, because a lot of times the bus was not full. She also thought about the fact that if we kept giving in, nothing would ever change. People asked her, was she afraid? She said she was not afraid, because she believed that what she was doing was right, though she knew that the consequences of her action could be very severe, could even cause her death. So they called the police came and arrested her. Now, the famous picture that you see with Mrs. Parks being fingerprinted, a lot of people believe that was the first time she was arrested. It was not. That was the second time she was arrested. The reason they don't show you the first time she was arrested, because she wasn't so well coiffured. That particular day, it was a protest by the entire leadership of the boycott. This was February 1956. And they told Dr. King that the leaders were going to be arrested. So 89 of them showed up, and they fingerprinted each one, took a picture of each one. Of course, they didn't expect 89 people to show up, but they all showed up to be fingerprinted and arrested. The other picture that's so famous that people think tell the history of Mrs. Parks is when she gave up her seat, was the picture where a white gentleman is sitting behind her and she's sitting in the front. That picture was taken at the end of the bus boycott on December the 21st, 1956. And the gentleman sitting behind her is a photographer from Look magazine. And that was a staged picture that they asked to be taken to show now Rosa Parks could sit in the front of the bus. And they took pictures of Dr. King, Reverend Abernathy, and a lot of other leaders. But because of the picture of February, they got so much press off of it, they took this other picture, and Look magazine published that picture. So those are the stories behind the pictures. The story behind Rosa Parks is that she was always an activist. She always worked for justice. At that time, the libraries were segregated. The students would dress up in her youth group. They would dress up in their Sunday best. They would go and try and take a book out from the library.
Explain what Sunday best was at that time.
Sunday best was whatever your school clothes were, neat and clean, your best shoes shined, and your whatever you could manage to get together for that best appearance, that was Sunday best. And each student would go up and ask if they could take a book out. And the librarian was about to pass out because, she was like, no, you can't take a book out. And the student would say, why can't I take a book out? You know why you can't take a book out. So that would be some of the protests that she put together, because at that time you had the students had to wait, the students of color had to wait for a mobile to come by the neighborhood. It was supposed to come by twice a week. Sometimes it was once a week. Sometimes it was once every other week. You would write down the book that you would like. They may have it, they may not have it. And especially if they thought it was a book that you should not be reading, then you could not get it. So if you had a report to do, you may or may not get the material that you needed. It's a whole lot different than today. Now, young people use all kinds of excuses for why they don't do their reports, but they can't say it's because they can't get the book out of the library. But those were some of the things that Mrs. Parks did early on, and then Ms. Steele will tell you all about the founding of the Institute.
Well, in Montgomery, one of the reasons that she came to Detroit, Michigan, was because her brother lived here. He was a serviceman, and he vowed that he would not return to the South, the segregated South, and that he wanted to move up north. And he was afraid for Mrs. Parks and his mother to remain there, and he asked that the family move north, which they did. And it was in Detroit that they thought it was going to be better, but they found out that it was more like up south, instead of down south. And it was very difficult to find jobs in the north. Mr. Parks, in particular, who was a barber, was not licensed in that area. He had to go back to barber school and to be trained and to get his license there. And it was very difficult because of the segregation in the north. There were still in some areas signs that remained there. Mrs. Parks was unable to find work also and ended up going to Hampton University, where she was a hostess. Actually, it was a domestic for the guest house, but she, in fact, received guests as well as took care of the guest house. And she enjoyed it as much as she could. However, her family missed her so much, and she missed them, that she developed ulcers, probably not only from being away from them, but many of the other things that she had experienced, that she did return to Detroit after a year. And very soon after that was when I had the opportunity of meeting her. She then was approached by Congressman John Conyers, who was his first time running for Congress, and he asked her to assist him with his election. He wanted Martin Luther King Jr. to endorse him or to say a good word for him, and he knew that he would not had he asked. And he asked Mrs. Parks if she would do that, and she agreed to do so. And of course, when Rosa Parks speaks, everybody listens. And Dr. King did come and speak to endorse Congressman John Conyers. And very soon after he won the election, he employed Mrs. Parks in his office. And there she remained for more than 23 years. So it was a wonderful time for them both. And I hope that you have an opportunity to hear Congressman Conyers speak one day on Mrs. Parks, because he has some very delightful stories as to that you would normally think that constituents would be coming to see him, but they weren't. They were coming to see Mrs. Parks. And Congressman Conyers' former chief of staff is with us this evening. Mr. Greg Moore, would you please stand? And while I am introducing a couple people, Mrs. Parks' godchildren are in the audience, Sydney and Sandrea, would you? Their brother, who is Nicole's best half, is in school this evening, and they are triplets. And Mrs. Parks is their godmother, or was their godmother. I still say is, because I feel that she's very much with us. But in Detroit, we had such a wonderful opportunity to change things there. And through the different events that Mrs. Parks participated in life events as well as professional events, we finally had an opportunity to do something that she wanted to do, which was honor her husband by starting the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development. He made so many sacrifices for her and for himself and for our country, but he was never recognized. That if they happened to be out together, they would treat him similar to the way they treated me sometimes. They would reach over us to get to Mrs. Parks or step on our feet or whatever they could do to get to Mrs. Parks. But, and he, in fact, received it as well as he could, but it was very difficult, for him to do that. And she knew the sacrifice that he made, not only in Detroit, but in Alabama. He lost his job as she lost her job, and it was a difficult time. So he loved her, and whatever she wanted to do, he wanted to support her in that. And for that, she wanted to honor him and honor his commitment to being a role model to other youth. So she named Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute in his honor, which motivates youth to reach their highest potential. And you'll have an opportunity to see them one more time. You saw some youth earlier that carried the signs, and that was very nice to see some of the historical footage of our programs that Mrs. Parks intimately worked in. And we look forward to those of you who would like to become a part of the Institute to join. We have many of our Pathway to Freedom alumni that are here. Please feel free to speak to them this evening. We have many of our leaders that are here, and I will call their names near the end of the program. But Anita is going to expound on a little more of our programming at the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute.
Well, at the Institute, there are two flagship programs, Pathways to Freedom, that Mrs. Parks and Ms. Steele started right after the Institute was founded. and Lila Cabbil, who you'll meet later, helped to form the first, what was called Reverse Freedom Tour. And that was where the students from the North went south to visit the civil rights sites in the South. And this was the late 80s. And Mrs. Parks had noticed that most young people didn't know very much by the late 80s about the civil rights movement. And when she got south, the students in the South said, well, nobody ever invites us to go north. They come down here as if we know everything, and we don't. And we would like to go north. So that's what they did. They brought the students from the north, and then together the students from the south went back north. And that was the way we started the program, which later became Pathways to Freedom, because there are many pathways to freedom. We have gone all over the country. We always travel to Canada each year. And the reason we go to Canada is because our organization, the national office, is based in Detroit, and we want young people to learn how to cross borders, because it's very important to know what you have to do in another country. And a lot of times, especially in Detroit, because you can see Windsor, young people forget that there are different rules in different countries. We've also traveled to Mexico. And we also want young people to know where they have been and where they're going. That is our thing, because if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. And so we do all of this by visually being involved and actually touching the research that we do. We also do a learning center called the Rosa Parks Learning Center. Mrs. Parks was asked in the early 90s to if she would be one of the seniors that would mentor young people in computer basics. Well, she said, well, when I was using the computer, they were still using key punch cards. I don't know anything about the PC. It seems to me that young people would do that a lot better than I. And so thus began the Rosa Parks Learning Center, where young people teach seniors computer basics. Now, it mostly seniors, but we'll teach any adult that that wants to know about the senior to youth that wants to know about the computer. Those programs take up 12 months of the year, and out of that we have health programs, entrepreneurship, and oral history programs that have been developed because of those. Ms. Steele and Mrs. Parks travel with the young people. Mrs. Parks was on that bus. We travel mostly by bus, and through 1996, and then 97, she started just picking parts of the trip. I think that it had more to do with the fact that our buses didn't always work too well, and I think she got tired of them breaking down sometimes, but she still was always involved with the youth.
Just a little bit about her demeanor. Mrs. Parks was a very quiet, soft-spoken person, never raised her voice. And people often ask, well, how did you, such a small in stature person, be able to have the courage to do what you did? And she would say, well, I just said no. And the reason being is that at that time, Mrs. Parks had been a part of Jim Crow in the South. That means segregation, basically, where there was a lot of humiliation. That particular year, Emmett Till had been killed. There had been soldiers that had been beaten on buses who had given their lives for their country. However, when they came back to the segregated South, they had other humiliations to be subjected to. And she said that she just could not move when she knew that she was sitting in the correct place. So she just quietly sat there, which is something that I would like for our young people to imitate sometimes, just as those are imitating that behavior in this audience, that they are quietly sitting and listening to these comments. Another thing that was very special about her was her dress. She was always a lady. Not until ES came into her life, Elaine Steele, did you see her occasionally wear a pair of slacks. She always wore a dress, but in later years, through my encouragement, she did wear slacks a couple times. So I take full credit for that. But she was always a lady, very immaculate, never did buttons hang on her clothes. Of course, you know that she was a seamstress, so her buttons were always tight. Her shoes were always shined very neatly. She was always immaculate, and if she wasn't immaculate, she didn't go out. So it was just a little bit difficult for her to look at some of our youth today, to look at what the new style is. But she always thought that the mind was more important than the style of dress. And as long as they were being educated and that something was going inside, that was the most important, and she would not worry about what was on the outside.
But she did keep up with the groups. She knew the latest in everything because she did follow. She was an avid reader, so she read as much as possible, and she watched television too, so she knew what was going on. And so when young people would ask, she had the answer. So she kept up. Another interesting point about Mrs. Parks was that, as I said, she was an avid reader. She got tons and tons of mail, and Mrs. Parks sometimes would be overwhelmed with trying to keep up with it. In the early days, she used to answer every letter hand by hand, and she would correct the spelling. She would, and she would send it back to the student and tell them to send it back to her corrected, or she would circle it. And but as the volume mounted, she had to change her tactics and allow us to help her. But she was always involved, even when she couldn't answer them all personally anymore. She read the letters, and they brought such smiles to her face. You can wrap up.
Ms. Cabbil, our President Emeritus, I will moderate our Q&A session now.
Okay. It's time for those of you who have some questions that would give Ms. Steele and Ms. Anita Peak an opportunity to share personal reflections, some insight in terms of Mrs. Parks' life and her character. Is there anyone who would like a question? There are microphones left and right. Gentleman standing at the mic.
Did Mrs. Parks ever talk to you about her experiences and connection at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee?
Yes, she
Good
did.
question.
Yes, she spoke fondly of her experiences at Highlander, and she knew Miles Horton, and in fact, that was the first place that she came where white and black people could interact together without fear of reprisal. And that was it was the beloved community that she had often dreamed of. They worked together. It was not like a hotel resort area where people were waiting on you. You had to work. You had to, make up your own bed and help with cooking and, but it was a wonderful opportunity to learn and interact together. And some of her fondest memories were at Highlander. And she met friends that she had for life there.
Yes, Septima Clark
Septima.
was one of her dear friends that she met at Highlander. And even though it was a wonderful environment, there were death threats. Miles Horton's life was threatened. The place was bombed, and that was because it was integrated. And at that time, for some people, nothing could be worse. But as far as Mrs. Parks was concerned, it made her decide even more to make a conscious decision not to hate, because she met white people that did not hate. And she felt that if Miles Horton could do something like that, then she knew that she could too.
That also, excuse me, that also reminds me of a question that Mrs. Parks was often asked when she was being interviewed. What can you do to stop racism? And she thought that that was, really a very directed question of her, how could she stop racism? And she said that it begins within each of us, and how your heart changes is how racism will stop. And, and that just reminded me of her experiences there at Highlander, because that one was, that principle was one that was encouraged throughout.
I want to comment that the program started today with the song "Oh Freedom," and Mrs. Parks was very, very fond of music and, as she called it, good singing and good preaching. And she met at Highlander one of the members of Sweet Honey in the Rock, and continued a long experience in terms of their relationship. I'm going to respond to the two people at the mic as Mrs. Parks would respond, and she would look over and see this young man and say, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes. What was Rosa Parks' husband's name?
Raymond. His name was Raymond Parks. And Raymond Parks was the one who got Mrs. Parks involved in the NAACP. He had already been in the NAACP almost 10 years before she became a member. And that was one of the things that attracted her to him, because she wasn't attracted to him originally, but it was his activism. Now, he was very attractive, but she just was not so attracted to him at first, but it was his activism. He worked very hard with the Scottsboro boys case, the 9 boys that were in prison supposedly for raping a white woman. And he worked, and he risked his life on a number of occasions. In fact, he was almost killed in some of his activist experiences. And for Mrs. Parks, that did it. And he also encouraged her to finish high school. after they married because he knew that that was something that she wanted to do very much, and she did.
And our young lady?
Okay.
Okay, she's going to defer to the student. That's the Rosa Parks style.
When Mrs. Parks was a congressional aide, did she have any contribution to civil rights legislation?
Well, Congressman Conyers often took her with him. Of course, as a congressional aide, she had duties as any of the other staff members would have, but hers was a little bit more because of her high-profile status, that she was able to affect legislation, as you said, but that was only from a constituency standpoint, not from writing bills, because that had to be done at a legislative level. But it was always very important and very motivating when Rosa Parks was in support of an issue, and that's why Congressman Conyers often had her with him.
And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, Mrs. Parks was very much involved, and especially the Voting Rights Act. That was very dear to her heart because Raymond Parks was never able to vote in Alabama. And she had to register 3 times before she finally received the right to vote in Alabama.
Ms. Peak, would you expand a little bit more on the process that she went through in terms of earning and getting her legal voting rights?
Yes, there were literacy tests, and they're talking about, in fact, 2007, a lot of people want to know, well, why is the Voting Rights Act important? Because there's the 15th Amendment that gives everybody the right to vote. Well, states' rights have also always trumped federal legislation. It means that states' rights were always more important. And so if a state put an encumbrance in, you had to adhere to it. And in the southern states, what they did was they put literacy tests in. Well, but they were only administered to people of color. And they would give you tests like knowing the state constitution. Or they would enact, plus literacy, you had to pay a poll tax, which would be a tax for each year that you did not vote. Though you were denied the right to vote, you still had to pay back to the time where you could have voted if they had allowed you to vote. So in Mrs. Parks' case, when she finally got the right to vote, she was in her late 30s, and she had to pay the poll tax back to the time when she was 18. 21. Then she went 3 times. The first time, they told her that she failed. The second time, she wrote down the questions and the answers. The next time, she told them, I have the questions and the answers from the test, so now tell me that I made a mistake. Because she had to figure out, how can I get it done quick enough in my allotted time? So she had practice. And so that's how she finally got her certificate to vote.
Valuable story. Now our young lady.
Good evening. I came down, first of all, because I wanted you to know that Dr. Battle and I are here from the National Congress of Black Women, an organization that I know is very dear to Mrs. Parks' heart, and she was very dear to us. We all knew her as the mother of civil rights, and as you said, this nice, wonderful, gentle, quiet woman. But I wonder if before she passed away, she had an opportunity to learn about the Senate apology on lynching, and if she had a reaction. Did she ever discuss with you war, foreign policy, or any of human rights around the world? Just any little tidbit, because those are my pet subjects.
Well, in the human rights area, she was very active, and she traveled around the world was very conscious of what was going on and was indeed an advocate for peace in those areas. As far as the lynching, the new law on lynching was concerned, other than to nod, that that it now was in fact a fact, that it had taken so long. She did not have a lot of comments to make about it. And in the latter years, she primarily smiled and nodded and made a few comments of approval or disapproval, but she did not have a lot of dialogue. As you knew, when she was more mobile, that Mrs. Parks was never an argumentative person. She was a person that would stand up in a positive manner and express her disapproval or how that would not be helpful to human beings, how that would be harmful to the health of human beings. And that was always the way that she explained things. And so those of us who were close to her, Lois Harris, who is in the audience, would you stand, Lois, please? That in Mrs. Parks' final years, that she was her caregiver, and she and Lois developed a rapport where they often talked of current issues. So.
Yes, this gentleman.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Ms. Peck and Ms. Steele, can you all elaborate on the early political activism and organizational affiliation that Rosa Parks was involved in prior to joining the NAACP?
Okay, prior to the NAACP, Mrs. Parks did not belong to a particular organization. She was a person who felt strongly that people should be treated equally. And she felt that no one should have to bow down or kowtow or hang their head, which was the custom in the South. And she did not believe in it. She did not do it. She did not go out of her way to try to cause trouble. She was not, quote unquote, a troublemaker, even though she was called that many times. But she wanted to be involved with anybody that was trying to help to make life better. And that's the way she always believed, and that's the way she always carried herself.
She was very active in church also. She was an insurance agent. She worked for Atlanta Life. So she was active in her profession, in her work profession. And she was a very devoted family member. She cared for her mother and her grandmother, as well as held down, a job, usually 2 or 3 jobs. So she was always working and always trying to help people. But her, I guess the formal organization that she belonged to was the NAACP, and she held many positions. She was Mr. E.D. Nixon's personal secretary for the NAACP. And in that capacity, she also interviewed persons who had been accosted, who had received segregated threats, and and asked them would they be willing to be a test case. That she interviewed persons with those experiences. So therefore, when she was arrested, it was very normal for her to move forward in that position, to be a test case herself.
And speaking of Mrs. Parks as a test case, her case was not taken to the Supreme Court. Most people think that it was. It was not. The case was Browder versus Gale, and Gale was the sheriff. And Browder, Miss Aurelia Browder, and there were 4 other women. There were 5 women all told. Mrs. Parks was the 5th. And they felt that Mrs. Parks' case was the weakest of the 5 cases because she was not sitting in the white section. She was sitting where she was supposed to be, and they were afraid that her case would be overturned possibly at the appellate level, even though she was found guilty, fined, and is still on the books as a convict, I guess. But but they dropped her case and took the other 4 cases to the Supreme Court.
Okay, this young lady.
After Rosa Parks going to jail for sitting on the bus, even though she was sitting in the right section, and after all the stuff that they fought for, do you think, how was her feelings towards now young black youth, most of them wanting to sit in the back of the bus now?
Well, her feeling was that she wanted you to sit where you wanted to, not that you couldn't sit in the back of the bus. It was you being able to sit wherever you wanted to sit. It was the freedom to do what you want to do. I think what bothered her more than anything is young people not doing their best. She always believed that education is freedom, and she always espoused in her life and in her organization to do your best. She wants you to read, write, do your math, have the best possible. And if you want to sit in the back of the bus, fine. But whatever it is, do the best that you can do. Be the best that you can be.
Yes.
Good evening, Ms. Steele and Ms. Peak. I'm so happy to be here. I have a comment, question-like. Some history books indicate that Mrs. Rosa Parks refused a seat because she was physically tired. Were you aware of that?
Oh, we've heard all kinds of stories. And Mrs. Parks, and she spoke so much during her life. It's just amazing that they never put up her words. But she's corrected people so many times. It had nothing to do with being physically tired. And as she said, she was no more tired that day than she was any other day. She worked every day. And so it had nothing to do with that. And if anybody noted, the Friday, she was arrested on Thursday. The Friday edition of the Montgomery Advertiser didn't even list her name. She was not important to the movement at that moment. They said a colored woman was arrested. It was them that said she was tired. It was the media, not Mrs. Parks.
Yes, young man.
Did Rosa Parks have kids?
No, she did not. Not biological children, but all of you were her children. She loved children immensely. And so all children were Rosa Parks' children.
Yes, young man.
What elementary school did Miss Rosa Parks attend?
Oh, good question.
She attended a one-room school in Pine Level, Alabama, and her mother was the teacher.
Yes, and our final question.
What was Rosa Parks' job?
What was her job?
Well, she had many jobs. When she was, at the time she was arrested, she was a tailor's assistant. She had been a seamstress. She sold insurance. She was a domestic. She was a volunteer for the NAACP and for church.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Steele, are you going to come and just share a few final comments?
Well, I want to say that you have really been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much for receiving us. Thank you.